Welcome aboard the dark waters of the Night Crew podcast, where true crime meets the unknown. Each month we dive into the eerie, the unsolved, and the stories that haunt the shadows. If it's creepy, mysterious, or just plain unsettling, you'll find it here. So light your lantern, step onto the deck, and prepare to uncover what lies beneath the surface.
This podcast contains discussions of true crime, disturbing content, and mature themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The Night Crew podcast aims to present stories with respect to the victims and their families, and the intent is never to sensationalize tragedy, but to shed light on the unknown and unexplained. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of The Night Crew. Today, we will be discussing the Night Stalker, Terror in the City of Angels. The Night Stalker, I've heard about him before. He's not as well known, but he is very notoriously known as being one of the worst serial killers. Obviously not the top of the list, but he's one of the worst. So, with that being said, we're just going to jump right into it, into the first opening section. Darkness fell over California in the summer of 1985. This wasn't the ordinary kind of darkness. This was something deeper, something alive. It crept through open windows and unlocked doors. It watched from the shadows, breathing in the terror of an unsuspecting city. And when it struck, it left behind scenes so brutal, so depraved, they felt less like crimes and more like messages from hell itself. The people of Los Angeles were used to sunshine, glamour, and the hum of endless nightlife. But that year, all of it was replaced with fear. People boarded up their windows, they slept with the lights on, they bought guns, knives, crosses, and locks, anything to feel safe from the faceless figure the media called the Night Stalker. He was a phantom, appearing and disappearing like smoke. No clear pattern, no obvious motive. He killed the old and the young. He broke into mansions and modest homes, raped, tortured, murdered, and mutilated with a level of sadism that defied logic. And what terrified the police most was that he seemed to enjoy every single second of it. By the time they caught him, Richard Ramirez had become more than just a serial killer. He was a symbol of chaos, a man who wore Satan's name like a badge and turned Los Angeles into his personal hunting ground. But long before he became a monster, he was a boy, shaped by violence, warped by obsession, and destined for destruction. This isn't just a story about murder, it's a story about fear itself. This is the story of Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker. So we will go into his early life like usual, how he, basically the making of a monster, essentially. Before he became known as the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez was just a boy, like anyone else, growing up in El Paso, Texas. He was born on February 29th, 1960. He was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. But even in childhood, Richard's world was filled with violence, fear, and trauma. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a former police officer in Mexico who worked on the Santa Fe Railroad after immigrating to the U.S. Julian was a strict, temperamental man known for his violent outbursts. Neighbors recalled hearing screams from the Ramirez household. His wife and children often bore the brunt of his anger. Richard was frequently beaten for even the smallest infractions, often locked in dark rooms for hours. And also, as a child, Richard suffered 2 serious head injuries. One when a dresser fell on him, knocking him unconscious, and another when he was hit in the head with a swing at age 5. Which, that must have been a heavy swing. I don't know how it hit him, but that severely damaged his brain. Both caused him to have frequent blackouts and epileptic seizures. Doctors later suggested these injuries may have contributed to brain damage, affecting his impulse control and aggression. He was quiet in school, tall, lanky, polite, but he struggled academically and socially. Teachers described him as distracted and disconnected. Around age 10, he began spending time at cemeteries and developed a fascination with death. His older cousin, Miguel, or Mike, would soon shape that fascination into something much darker. Influence of his cousin, Mike. Mike Ramirez was a decorated Vietnam veteran who had returned home deeply traumatized and very unstable. But to young Richard, Mike was exciting, charismatic, fearless, and full of wild stories about war, death, and sex. He showed Richard Polaroids of Vietnamese women he had raped, tortured, and killed during the war. Some of the photos showed severed heads and bodies. To a 12-year-old boy already exposed to violence, it was horrifying and also mesmerizing to him. Mike bragged about killing without remorse, about how easy it was to dominate and destroy. He told Richard that power and fear were the real sources of control in life. This became a cornerstone of Richard's developing worldview. Then, one night in 1973, right in front of Richard, Mike shot and killed his wife. His wife's name was Jessie, and this was during an argument they were having. So, Richard was splattered with blood, and he did not look away. It was his first experience witnessing death up close, and obviously it left a permanent scar. So now, the downward spiral begins. After Mike was institutionalized, Richard began to drift. He withdrew from school, started using marijuana, LSD, and even sniffing glue. He also developed an obsession with Satanism and the occult, claiming it gave him a sense of control in a chaotic life. He began breaking into homes to steal money and valuables, crimes that escalated as he got older. By his mid-teens, he was sleeping in graveyards, stealing cars, and peeping into people's windows at night. Friends would later say there was something off about him. A deadness in his eyes, a fascination with violence and gore. He idolized serial killers and devoured true crime magazines. He also developed a fixation on sex and death intertwined, a disturbing combination that would define his later crimes. One friend recalled him saying, "Murder is pure. It's the ultimate freedom. You take life, you play God." And then we go into his early criminal activity. In 1977, at age 17, Richard dropped out of high school completely. He moved to Los Angeles, where he worked odd jobs and continued to burgle homes. That's actually the correct way to say it. Burgle homes. Police arrested him multiple times for theft and possession of marijuana. Around this time, he began experimenting with more violent crimes like assaults, peeping, and breaking into homes while people were asleep, just to watch them at night. He also began sleeping during the day and roaming the city at night, a pattern that would later earn him the name the Night Stalker. Richard's descent into full-blown violence wasn't sudden. It was the result of years of abuse, trauma, and exposure to death. By the time he began his murder spree in 1984, he was already completely disconnected from empathy and reality. He just disassociated from everything, essentially. Now I'm going to go a little bit into the psychological profile of him. So, psychologists later describe Ramirez as a textbook example of antisocial personality disorder with strong elements of sadism and psychopathy. His childhood trauma, brain injuries, and exposure to extreme violence create a perfect storm. One that transformed him from a neglected child into a remorseless killer. Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist, once said, Richard's childhood was like a horror film playing in slow motion. He was brutalized, neglected, and fed darkness until that all he could give back to the world. Now, before we go deeper into Richard's crimes, I want to take a moment to clear up something important that's often just... A lot of people don't know the difference between, Satanism, good and bad. So I'm going to go into that a little bit. So Ramirez claimed to be a Satanist by, I'm going to talk more about how he is a Satanist, but for example, he shouted, "Hail Satan" in court, he drew pentagrams, and told victims they were going to die in the name of the devil. But make no mistake, what Ramirez followed wasn't true Satanism. It was a perversion of it. Now, I don't practice Satanism, I don't practice it, but you have to be respectful about other people's religions, and you also need to be sure you know the facts before judging anyone. After all, if you are religious, you should accept people for what they believe and just move on from it. But regardless, there's a crucial difference between what I'll call bad Satanism, the warped, sensationalized version Ramirez used to justify his sadism, and the actual religious or philosophical forms of Satanism practiced by many people today. For example, there's the Church of Satan, founded by, I believe it's Antoine LaVey in 1966. And it doesn't worship an actual devil at all. Its beliefs are largely atheistic and symbolic, emphasizing individuality, self-empowerment, and rejecting blind obedience to authority. There's no sacrifice, there's no killing, no evil required to be in that religious organization. Similarly, groups like the Satanic Temple are politically and socially focused, advocating for separation of church and state, critical thinking, and compassion. Now, they don't harm anyone, and they certainly don't condone murder. What Ramirez embraced wasn't religion at all. It was a weapon against his victims. He twisted the imagery of Satan into something dark and theatrical to amplify fear, both in his victims and in the public. It was all a part of his control, his power trip. But it wasn't Satanism. It was sadism dressed up as the devil. And with that in mind, we return to the story, because Richard's warped beliefs were about to become a key part of his killing spree. They weren't just crimes, they were rituals of terror. So I'm going to go into his first crimes and the escalation from there. The hunting begins. By the early 1980s, Richard Ramirez had left Texas behind, but he hadn't left the darkness that had been growing inside of him. In 1984, he arrived in California, a city of sun, glitz, and endless nightlife. But Ramirez saw it differently. To him, it was a playground. A place where he could strike at random and watch fear bloom like a wildfire. His first known attacks were burglaries, often escalating into assaults. He would break into homes at night through unlocked windows or by prying doors open. He carried a .22 caliber handgun, knives, and sometimes a tire iron. At first, the attacks were very self-centered, but very quickly, a pattern began to emerge. Brutal, violent, and unpredictable. One early victim described waking to find a shadow in her bedroom, a figure moving silently. She remembered a strange, almost ceremonial chant, words she didn't understand, whispered by a man with a pentagram etched into his hand. She survived, but the trauma lasted a lifetime. Within months, the murders began. Richard's attacks were horrifically random. He would attack men, women, old, rich, young, poor. No one was safe. He often attacked couples at home, sometimes entering through a window while they slept. Some victims were tied up, some shot, some stabbed repeatedly. He left behind a signature everywhere he went, which was pentagrams written in blood, messages written in ash or lipstick, symbols of fear meant to terrify anyone who might discover the scene. Survivors spoke of a man who laughed, taunted, and displayed absolute pleasure in terrorizing them. One woman later recalled how he forced her to the floor, whispered, "Hail Satan," and threatened her life while moving through the house like a predator, inspecting his territory. Another escaped after he bound her hands, but the memory of the pentagram etched into her living room wall stayed with her forever. His MO quickly became terrifyingly consistent. Home invasions at night, sexual assault, brutal violence, and the use of satanic imagery to amplify fear. But unlike many killers, Ramirez did not have a single type of victim. He did not strike for financial gain. He did not strike for revenge. He killed because he could, because he wanted to make people suffer. While Ramirez appeared chaotic, there was a method to his madness. He typically targeted homes with easy access, unlocked windows, doors, or sliding glass panels. He preferred single-story houses so he could move quickly in and out without being spotted. He would often enter at night, between 2 and 4 a.m., when people were in the deepest stages of sleep. Sometimes he'd prowl neighborhoods hours before, cutting phone lines or watching from the shadows to learn people's routines. Police later found that many of his crimes followed a triangular route between East LA, the San Gabriel Valley, and Orange County, suggesting he had a favorite hunting ground where he felt comfortable and obviously unseen. Each attack escalated in violence and audacity. He would break into homes of prominent neighborhoods one night, then return to humble apartments the next. Sometimes he struck at multiple homes in the same night, leaving victims alive, dead, or barely clinging to life. His unpredictability paralyzed the city. Psychologists would later note that Richard's crimes were ritualistic, not in the sense of formal religious practice, but as a dark theater of control and terror. Each invasion, each symbol drawn, each life threatened or destroyed was a performance. And for Ramirez, the audience was everyone in Los Angeles, watching helplessly from behind locked doors and drawn curtains. At several crime scenes, he drew pentagrams on walls, mirrors, and even on victims' bodies. But he didn't perform formal rituals. They were meant to terrify, to violate, and to make people believe he was more than human. He once forced a victim to swear to Satan rather than to God, using religion as a weapon to degrade and dominate. Later, when arrested, he drew pentagrams on his hand and shouted, "Hail Satan" in court, as I stated earlier. A move prosecutors described as half showmanship, half insanity. He was fascinated by LaVey's Church of Satan, as I mentioned earlier, though there's no evidence he was actually a member of that church. LaVey himself later dismissed Ramirez as a deceased mind, not a true Satanist. Ramirez was basically using Satanism to scare people. He was not practicing it. He was not doing rituals. He basically had nothing to do with it. He just knew people would be scared of, pentagrams and talking about Satan and whatnot. That is truly the only reason he did that, for fear. So then there's the reign of terror, expanded crimes. Richard's attacks were not only violent, but sadistic and psychological. Survivors recounted being tied up, raped, and physically assaulted while he mocked and threatened them. One teenage girl said, "He looked at me like he was enjoying my fear more than anything else in the world. I thought I was going to die, and he wanted me to feel it." Another survivor found a pentagram drawn in her blood on a door frame. He sometimes revisited homes, leaving cryptic graffiti, pentagrams, and signs of his presence. These weren't religious acts, they were his signature, a way to extend fear beyond the immediate attack. Randomness was key. He attacked couples, children, and the elderly. He used guns, knives, blunt objects, and cords, sometimes killing, sometimes sparing, sometimes sexually assaulting both men and women. One of the reasons the Night Stalker terrified Los Angeles so deeply was that he truly had no type. Unlike most serial killers who fixate on a particular gender or age group, Richard's victims ranged from 9 years old all the way up to 83 years old. Detectives said it was like he wanted to prove he could get away with anything. This randomness paralyzed entire neighborhoods. People stopped sleeping, nailed their windows shut, bought dogs, and slept with guns beside their beds because they were so terrified of this man. The psychological toll on survivors was profound. Many suffered PTSD, insomnia, and anxiety for years. Families relocated. Neighborhoods changed. Richard's terror extended far beyond his victims. He had immobilized an entire city with fear. The media called him the Night Stalker. Coverage fueled the panic. Ramirez watched, smirked, and planned his next attacks. Each headline became part of his dark theater, proving that terror itself was his true weapon. His psychological games. Ramirez enjoyed taunting survivors and the police. In one case, he told a victim he'd be back, then returned days later just to prove he could. In another, he spared a child, telling her to tell them the Night Stalker was here. He also sometimes watched news reports of his crimes while staying in cheap motels, smiling at the fear he'd cause. Detectives found it chilling that he seemed to crave the panic as much as the violence. He once told a jailhouse informant, this is Richard, "Killing is like smoking a cigarette. You get the taste and you can't quit." Investigation and the manhunt, chasing a ghost. The Night Stalker case became one of the first major manhunts in U.S. history to combine traditional police work with new forensic science. It was the matching of a singular fingerprint lifted from a stolen car Ramirez had abandoned that finally linked him to multiple murders. The LAPD distributed over 20,000 wanted posters across California, and the public played a direct role in his capture when residents recognized him and beat him down until police arrived. LAPD was chasing a shadow. Ramirez struck whenever he wanted, leaving minimal forensic evidence, moving across counties and blending into crowds. Witnesses described a wiry man with piercing eyes, a smirk, and a pentagram on his hand, but he vanished before they could catch him. The city was in panic. Residents patrolled streets with guns and bats. task force coordinated across jurisdictions, analyzing hundreds of reports. Finally, on August 31st, 1985, Ramirez attempted to steal a car. Witnesses recognized him, chased him, and held him down until police arrived. For the first time in months, LA could breathe, though the trauma would remain. And now I'll go into the trial of Richard Ramirez. So, when Richard was finally brought to trial, LA wasn't just relieved, it was ravenous for justice. The media had already made him a monster, but no one was prepared for how bizarre and unsettling his trial would actually be. The trial began in July 1988, nearly 3 years after Richard's arrest. From the very start, it was a legal circus. The case involved 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. It was one of the most complex criminal cases in California's history at the time. It was delayed again and again over 30 pretrial motions, changes in defense counsel, and disputes about his mental state. At one point, he tried to fire his lawyers and represent himself, claiming they didn't understand him or the power of Satan. In court, he often laughed at testimony describing his crimes. He would lean back casually in his chair, and he would stare down jurors. When reporters asked if he felt remorse, he replied with a grin, "No big deal. Death comes with the territory." Then there's the satanic spectacle. His behavior in court was designed to provoke and unsettle people. On the first day, he raised his hand to the cameras, a pentagram drawn on his palm, and shouted, "Hail Satan." He wore dark sunglasses, black clothes, and smirked through witness testimonies. Victims' families described feeling like they were staring into pure emptiness. One prosecutor later said it was like he enjoyed the show. The trial wasn't about guilt, it was about control, even behind bars. Security fears and threats. The trial was held under extreme security. Deputies stood near Ramirez at all times because of his unpredictable behavior, and because there were rumors of a contract hit placed on him by satanic cult sympathizers. At one point, a jury member was found murdered, which caused immediate panic. Police determined it was unrelated to the case, a domestic incident, but it terrified the rest of the jury. The event nearly derailed the proceedings entirely. Some jurors admitted later that they had nightmares about Ramirez throughout the entirety of the trial. One said it felt like he was looking through you, like he could see what you were afraid of. And then there's the disturbing evidence. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including fingerprints, shoe prints, ballistics, and stolen jewelry found in Richard's possession. They also played videotaped testimonies from survivors, which left the courtroom in tears. One young girl described waking up to Richard's face, inches from hers, the smell of decay and sweat heavy in the air. When his signature Avia shoe print was matched to multiple crime scenes, the only pair of that model sold in LA, it sealed his fate. The jury also saw photographs of the pentagrams he'd drawn on walls and the satanic graffiti scrawled in victims' homes, showing his psychological need to mark his territory. The fans and the obsession. As shocking as it sounds, Ramirez attracted a cult following of admirers, mostly young women who wrote him love letters, sent nude photos, and filled the courtroom gallery daily. They were known as the Night Stalker groupies. Some even dressed in black, wore pentagram necklaces, and mimicked his smirk. One woman, Doreen Leoy, became his most devoted fan, writing him over 75 letters and eventually marrying him in San Quentin prison in 1996. Reporters described the atmosphere as a gothic sideshow, with hysteria, lust, and horror blending together. The defense strategy. Richard's defense team argued that the police had botched the investigation, mishandled evidence, and fueled a media frenzy that made a fair trial impossible. They even tried to claim he was mentally incompetent, but multiple psychiatrists testified that he was fully aware of his actions. He simply just didn't care. When asked if he worshipped Satan, Ramirez replied calmly, "I believe in evil. I don't have to worship it, I am it." The verdict. After over a year of testimony, the jury finally reached a verdict on September 20th, 1989. Richard Ramirez was found guilty on all 43 charges, including 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. When asked if he had any final words, Ramirez leaned into the microphone and said almost gleefully, "You don't understand me. You never will. You can't kill me. I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells within us all." Then he flashed his trademark grin and threw up a pentagram sign. Sentencing. Ramirez was sentenced to death in California's gas chamber. The judge told him, "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to die in the manner prescribed by the laws of the state of California. This sentence is fitting, for your crimes are beyond imagination." Ramirez didn't flinch. He smiled and whispered, "See you in Disneyland." Afterward, one juror said, "I've never seen evil so comfortable in its own skin." So afterwards, overall, the trial lasted over a year and cost more than $1.8 million, one of the most expensive in California at that time. It also prompted new laws to streamline death penalty appeals and handle high-profile cases with greater security. Even after conviction, Ramirez seemed to revel in the attention. In one jailhouse interview, he said, "I gave the people what they wanted," or "I'm just a reflection of your society." He remained on death row for nearly 24 years, never expressing an ounce of remorse. Despite being sentenced to death in California's gas chamber in 1989, he never made it that far because the appeals process and death penalty cases can drag on for decades, and Richard's case was one of the longest. The final years of Richard Ramirez. After his conviction, Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, home to California's death row. He was kept mostly in isolation under constant supervision due to security risks and his celebrity status among both inmates and the public. Over the years, he maintained a disturbingly calm demeanor, writing letters to admirers, sketching pentagrams, and corresponding with his wife, Doreen, who continued to insist he was kind and misunderstood. Inmates who interacted with him said he was eerily quiet, but could turn cold and smug without warning. One guard described him as a walking shadow, like he was waiting for something to come collect him. In prison, Ramirez showed no remorse. He received hundreds of fan letters, especially from women who were drawn to his dark, mysterious persona. He would spend his days writing, sketching pentagrams, and writing disturbing letters. One of the guards there once said, "He never seemed afraid of dying. He said Satan would take care of him when it was time." In his death, on June 7th, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at the hospital at age 53. The official cause of death was B-cell lymphoma, a form of blood cancer. He also suffered from chronic hepatitis C and declining health due to years of substance abuse. At the time of his death, he had been on death row for over 23 years. There were no public signs of remorse, confession, or final statement. He died alone with no family present. The news of his death made headlines worldwide. Some of his victims' families expressed relief, while others said they wished justice had been carried out through execution. The Los Angeles Times reported, "The Night Stalker's death brings an end to one of California's darkest nightmares, but the scars he left will never fully heal." Ramirez was never buried under his real name due to fears that his grave might become a site for morbid fascination or occult gatherings. His body was reportedly cremated, and the remains were released quietly to a family representative. Survivors continued to cope with long-lasting trauma. Some moved away, others suffered nightmares and anxiety for years. Law enforcement changed how they coordinated across jurisdictions and handled serial crimes. Media coverage continued to sensationalize Ramirez, making him a figure in documentaries, books, and TV specials. While public fascination persisted, the story also serves as a warning. Monsters can hide in plain sight, and fear can be weaponized. Culturally, Ramirez inspired true crime studies, psychological analysis, and even horror media. His story reminds us that evil can be charismatic, cunning, and unpredictable. Richard Ramirez's story is more than a series of murders. It's a study of fear, power, and cruelty. Healing for survivors is ongoing, and these psychological scars remain. For all of us, the lesson is vigilance. Awareness, community, and preparedness are the antidotes to fear. Ramirez thrived not on ideology, but on sadism and control, using satanic imagery to terrify, not to practice faith. The Night Stalker is gone, but the shadows of his crimes linger. We remember the victims, learn from the mistakes, and confront the uncomfortable truth. Evil walks among us, often unseen until it's too late. This has been the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. We remember the terror, honor the survivors, and remain vigilant, for monsters can hide where we least expect them. If you would like to hear a story that interests you, make sure to comment or DM the Night Crew on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube. And finally, due to Halloween coming up, the veil is thin, the night is dark, and the stories are real. Have a hauntingly beautiful Halloween, and above all, be safe.